With the collapse of FTX, I wanted to talk a bit about another exchange collapse in blockchain history, and how it relates to Sam Bankman-Fried's possible plan to pay back his creditors and customers. Unfortunately, if you lost money to this, you're likely to get even madder hearing this. Okay, let's go back to Mt. Gox. Originally, this was a website for users to buy and sell Magic the Gathering cards, hence Magic the Gathering Online Exchange. It was created by Jed McCaleb in 2007, but it went dormant until 2010, when Jed thought it would be a good idea to repurpose it into a Bitcoin exchange. He kept us going until March 2011, when he sold an 88% share of the site to Mark Kapelis. Because, like any programmer, he had just too many projects to work on, and he wanted someone else to take it on and run with it. Kapelis was then the CEO of the site until it collapsed in February 2014. So who was this guy? Well, he was born in France, but moved to Japan in 2009. He was an early adopter of Bitcoin and was even a founding member of the Bitcoin Foundation after acquiring Mt. Gox. However, after the exchange failed, customers lost hundreds of millions of dollars in Bitcoin, and later in 2015 he was arrested for falsifying data, specifically that he had manipulated exchange volume leading up to the collapse. It's worthwhile to note, he was never actually charged with fraud. It was even a suspended sentence he got, so assuming he isn't charged with another crime until the end of 2023, he won't get any jail time. Okay, so let's see what happened. It's 2013. Bitcoin is first appearing in the mainstream news as a new kind of digital money. And sometimes you hear people say, oh, if I had known about Bitcoin back in the day, I would have bought 100 of them. I just want to say, there's no way you would have done that in 2013. Mt. Gox had 70% of the exchange volume, but it was in Japan. Every exchange was legally sketchy, so your best bet for buying Bitcoin was to find someone online that was in your area that would act as a liaison between buyers and sellers. So you would have to go find someone online, meet them somewhere in real life, and then give them cash to get some sketchy new internet money that criminals use. Not many people were doing that. Mining Bitcoin made a bit more sense, but by 2013, ASICs, or application-specific integrated circuits, so specially designed computers to mine Bitcoin, had just taken over Bitcoin mining, so you would have had to spend thousands of dollars on an ASIC and then run it for months to get Bitcoin worth the cost of electricity you spent to get them. But, assuming you got your hands on some, during that year the price of Bitcoin went from 20 USD to 1,000. But what happened in 2014? Well, in the months leading up to February 2014, Mt. Gox was having issues, and it stopped allowing Bitcoin withdrawals. The price had peaked and was starting to drop, so people wanted to take their assets off the exchange. Now, there had been hacks on the exchange before, there were a lot in fact, with many user accounts losing their money or Bitcoin, but that was the stuff in the news. Behind the scenes, things were much more dire. Mt. Gox started using cold storage for most of their held BTC, but in November 2011, they had a shortfall in their hot storage, or readily available Bitcoin. So they transferred over the cold storage into their hot wallets. That doesn't sound so bad, but starting in August that year, the actual amount of Bitcoin held in their hot wallets was shrinking compared to the expected total amount of Bitcoin they had. Slowly, over time, Bitcoin was being siphoned off of these hot wallets and going outside the exchange. This went on for years. I mean, after moving the funds out of cold storage, you would have expected that they would have done some better accounting to figure out what was going on, but somehow that didn't happen. The hackers, or maybe someone on the inside, it's hard to say, had laundered the funds through a bunch of other exchanges, and sometimes even through Mt. Gox itself. One guy taken down in this was Alexander Vinnik, who was running a Russian exchange called BTCE. The site was found to be laundering bitcoins from various places, including a small amount from the Mt. Gox hack itself, and Vinnik was arrested in 2017. After being transported around a few countries, he's now scheduled to be sentenced for more money laundering crimes in the US. Pretty much all the exchanges at this time ended up being shut down one way or another, some because of theft, some because of hacks, fraud, money laundering, or just countries cracking down on crypto as a whole. But this is where things get interesting. Mt. Gox filed for bankruptcy, but a month after doing so, they found an old cold storage wallet that still had bitcoins in it. In the graph that showed the estimated actual Bitcoin holdings of Mt. Gox over time, this was the solid orange line at the bottom. So this means that of the 850,000 Bitcoins that were missing, 200,000 were accounted for. The bankruptcy and legal case against Mt. Gox lasted for years, In fact, the payments are just starting to come out now in 2023. But the thing about bankruptcy is that the creditors are not actually owed 650,000 bitcoins. They were owed the value of 650,000 bitcoins at the time of the bankruptcy. While I'm not a lawyer, I've been told that in contract law, for example, if you have a contract with a manufacturer to make, say, 1,000 widgets, each one worth roughly $1, then if the manufacturer reneges on the contract, they don't owe you the $900 you might have given them for the contract. They owe you the value of those widgets, so $1,000. The opposite is also true. If you gave them, say, $1,200 to make those widgets, they might only owe you $1,000 instead. Legally speaking, anyway. Law is complicated. So Mt. Gox in bankruptcy really owes its creditors a few $100 million. That's 650,000 bitcoins at $500 a pop. While the value of that remaining 200,000 bitcoins, at the time of this recording, is actually worth around $3 billion. Legally, that difference in value goes to the shareholders of Mt. Gox, which is mainly Carpalis. In effect, this was like doing an incredibly leveraged long call on the price of Bitcoin where you can't actually get margin called for 10 years, which is ridiculous. By March 2018, the trustee assigned to the Mt. Gox bankruptcy had actually claimed to have sold enough BTC of the remaining holdings to cover all the creditors. But at least according to the news reports in 2022, the trustee had reached an agreement to allocate 90% of the remaining 142,000 bitcoins to the creditors. Keep in mind, Carpalis did own some of the stolen bitcoins as well, about 100,000 I believe, so that's where the 90% number is coming from, I think. But that's much less money than what they probably had to award the creditors, legally speaking. Now, was this fraud? When I first heard about this, I thought it was. Carpalis escaped with only a suspended sentence, the hack seemed too convenient, it went on for too long, it seemed like it was an inside job. But now, I'm not so sure. As I said, he probably could have walked away with billions, but the wording of the agreement seems to say that he will only get a few $100 million instead, which is reasonable compared to how much Bitcoin he lost himself. Was it an inside job with an employee stealing the funds? Was it a hacker who gained access to the internal systems and started draining accounts? Was it a user that found an exploit and was able to credit their account with a few extra Bitcoins and left a script running for years? Nobody knows for sure. Regardless of what happened, Carpalis was never shown to be behind the hack, so there was never a strong case of fraud, at least in Japan. He was tried in absentia in France, but that's about it. After the Mt. Gox debacle, he slowly slid out of the limelight in the crypto world, and right now is the CTO of a virtual desktop company instead. So how does this apply to FTX? Sam Bankman-Fried will not get a light sentence, not by a long shot, but maybe he can do a plea bargain, try to get it down to 20 years or so. Martin Scarelli, the farmer bro that got sentenced for defrauding people with his pharmaceutical-based hedge fund, that's what he thinks, and I take his word for it. He has first-hand experience negotiating with the Fed, so let's say it's 20 years. The bankruptcy proceedings will likely go as long as the Mt. Gox ones did, so whatever funds are held by the trustee would appreciate for 10 years before having to pay out that $3 billion or so that's currently owed. Well, there's interest, so maybe it's more like $5 billion that needs to be paid out by the time the bankruptcy finishes. The funds being held right now, or some of the funds held in the Bahamas, could be used for this. There's like $1 billion right there. Even the funds that were hacked just after FTX declared bankruptcy might magically be returned to the FBI 5 years later from now by an anonymous user. If the price of those assets appreciate during that time period, Sam could end up being a very rich billionaire when he leaves prison. As I said before, like taking a leveraged long call in Bitcoin where you don't actually get margin called for 10 years. It's right up his alley. This is speculation at this point, but there's good legal precedent that this could actually happen. But let's go back to Jed. You might have been thinking, poor Jed, he sold early and missed out on an opportunity to get in on the next big thing. Well, don't shed too many tears for him. A few months after selling Mt. Gox, he started working on a project that would eventually become Ripple. Not only that, but a few years later he left and co-founded another blockchain called Stellar. Now, XRP, the currency of Ripple, has gone up and down in price, but at the time of recording, his holdings are valued at over $2 billion. Yeah, he's doing fine. I couldn't be happier for the guy. So the real lesson here, creating value through innovation is where the real money is, not scamming, fraud, or money laundering. Now that was a little dive into some blockchain history. It was a fun little distraction looking to the Mt. Gox collapse again. It's been a while since I read about it, and despite all the changes since then, I think it's still a good lesson for today's crypto users and developers. But speaking of hacks and frauds, I wanted to talk about Oracle-less smart contracts next. There's been some attacks happening against price oracles in the DeFi space, and I wanted to talk about some approaches to removing oracles from contracts to get around this potential type of attack. I'm not sure when I'll be able to do a write-up, but it should make for a good video. Anyway, I'm Barry. Good luck investing.